So, I just got a question, because you've been in this place. I know that you have. It's when you get into the car with your parents because you're going to visit family or you're going on a vacation, and if you were like me and my family, we actually all fought for the back seat because you could have it all to yourself and stretch out your legs and lay down and stuff. And we couldn't really be on our phones back then because there was no such thing as smartphones at the time. But we could at least lay there and entertain ourselves with our thoughts and maybe listen to our CD player, which was pretty awesome. But it's when you could listen to like whole albums all the way through because you weren't listening to a playlist or something. But anyway, that's beside the point. You've been in that position where you've been in the car, whether you're in the back seat or not, and you've been there for a while. Your legs are starting to hurt. Maybe you have to go to the bathroom, and you ask the question, the dreaded question that parents absolutely hate. That question is, are we there yet? You guys know exactly. Are we there yet? So how many of you guys, by show of hands, been on a long road trip before? Okay, 6 hours at least. Okay, 8 hours? Okay, 27, 22. Anybody beat 27? Okay. California. Where in California? That's Nevada. Los Angeles? It's past Las Vegas. Somewhere in California. But you remember it's 27 hours. Did you guys like stop at like a, did you go camping? Do you have an RV? Did you stop in a hotel? Did you drive all the way through for 27 hours? I remember when when Chelsea and I were a year into our marriage, we decided to take our first vacation together to celebrate our 1-year anniversary. And we drove, because we lived in Joplin, Missouri at the time, and we drove to the very tip of Florida where her aunt lived. And it was 22 hours, so it was not 27 hours, but we decided to drive all the way through without stopping. So we left in the middle of the night and then tried to drive all the next day. And then we got there in the middle of the night the next day. It was 1 in the morning by the time we got there. Whew, and I do not miss that trip. But long road trips are hard because you have to constantly wait. They take lots and lots of time. How many of you guys, you are patient people? Anybody patient in here? I'm keeping my hand down because I'm not. But patience is a virtue that I've been told will never hurt you. But yet I still don't practice it well sometimes. I've gotten better as I get older. But patience is hard because waiting for things is really, really difficult. And no matter what we're waiting on, whether it could be the destination to the beach, the destination to your favorite theme park, the destination to whatever vacation you're excited to go on, or if you've gone on trips with us, like to CIY Believe, or you haven't been to CIY Move because you're not that old yet, but you'll get to go. How many of you guys are 8th graders? You will be eligible for CIY Move this next year, and it's going to be fun. We're going to have a little bit of a road trip for that one because we're going to Tennessee, but it's going to be good. But no matter what it is that we're waiting on, the waiting part isn't usually the most fun part. It's the part that we kind of dread getting through to get to the fun part. And honestly, I think forgiveness is the same way. A lot of times forgiveness isn't just I'm sorry, I forgive you, you move on. Remember when your parents made you do that with your siblings, or maybe they still do that? They're like, say you're sorry. Sorry. Say you forgive them. I forgive you. Okay, now go play. And then you're still kind of mad, but then you get over it and you keep playing. Forgiveness isn't always like that, like the childhood version. It's sometimes something where somebody hurts you and you just have that pain in your heart every time you think about them or around them, and you don't want to be around them, and it takes more time. It takes a long time sometimes because forgiveness isn't quite as quick as we want. And just to recap our definition of forgiveness, it's letting go of negative feelings we have towards someone who has hurt, harmed, or disappointed us. And forgiveness takes longer than we'd like. Forgiveness oftentimes is something that we have to do over and over and over again because it takes more and more and more time to do it sometimes. There's some people, you have friends, right, where you've gotten in tiffs before and you're like, I forgive you, it's fine. And then you just kind of move on and it's whatever. right? They're friends that are more like siblings that you're able to get over things quicker. But then you have the friends that are like, they wound you and like they knew exactly what to do to wound you just right, to hit your button. And forgiving them is a little more difficult because you knew that they meant to do it. And even if they didn't really mean to do it, they should have known that what they were doing. And so forgiving them is a little bit harder. And maybe the severity of the crime against you was bigger, and so it takes more time. Sometimes, honestly, this is hard, and why it takes so much time is because sometimes you forgive and nothing changes. How many of you would hope that when someone says sorry and you forgive them, you would assume that that means they would change and they wouldn't do it again? But how many of you have been proven wrong on that? That oftentimes nothing changes and they do it again the next day or like the next minute. And you're like, I just forgave you for that. What are you doing? Like, we just talked about this. I don't want to be a drama queen or anything, but you just did this. And now you did it again. Now I'm mad at you again, right? And so, like, forgiveness sometimes it's hard because nothing seems to really change. It seems like you're the one that's doing all the forgiving all the time, and they're not changing their ways. They're still hurting the people around them, and mainly you. And so forgiveness is hard. Maybe it's because your feelings don't change. Whether it's you're forgiving them, but really you're still kind of mad and it hurts. And so maybe how do you handle that where nothing changes in your own heart? Or maybe it's the other person that doesn't change, like we just talked about, or maybe the situation doesn't change. Like maybe that person was sorry, maybe forgave someone, but that doesn't change the fact that what's done is done, and you can't change that anymore. And some of you have had to deal with that. Or maybe the situation is reversed, and you are the one that actually needs forgiveness. And even though you receive forgiveness, you still feel bad. You feel like maybe the relationship isn't what it once was because you are sorry and you needed the forgiveness, but it feels like they said they forgave you, but you feel like it's not the same. And so forgiveness can be really tough for a lot of those reasons. But the good news is the person who probably knows the most about forgiveness is God, because he's forgiven us of much. And so when Jesus was walking the earth, when he was doing his ministry, and when he was teaching to tons of people, he had large crowds that followed and paid attention and listened to him and put a lot of stock in what he had to say. And so Jesus actually understood this idea of forgiveness quite a bit. And when he was teaching, even his disciples didn't really understand, everything at first. And so one of them, Peter, he actually asks Jesus this question. This is what it says in Matthew 18. Then Peter came to him, Jesus, and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Now, how many of you feel like that's a good number, right? 7 times is a good amount of times to forgive somebody. If they need forgiveness more than 7 times, then there's something wrong with them, right? How many? 7 feels like a good amount of time. So, like, just to count it out here, like we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's a lot to forgive somebody. It's like every time you forgive them, you give them a piece of candy. Okay, you got 6 more left, right? So, but here's the thing. In this day and age, they thought a lot like we do in some ways, and like they kind of had a 3 strikes you're out mentality. So it's like they thought that like if somebody sins against you, like you can forgive them like 3 times, and if they keep doing it, then they don't deserve your forgiveness anymore. That was kind of the mentality. And we kind of share this mentality a lot, if we're honest. And so Peter thinks he's actually like giving a really like good Sunday school answer by going above and beyond and saying, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? Thinking he's like, Jesus always surprises us with these teachings. He always, so I'm just going to go ahead and one up myself now. Instead of saying 3, I'm going to say 7. Because what was typical was 3 times. And so 1, 2, 3. Should we forgive people 7 times? And then Jesus responds in the way that only Jesus can. And he says, no, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. So if you thought 7 was a lot, just imagine like 490. That's how much you should forgive somebody. Imagine there's 490 pieces of candy here, because let's be honest, there's not. I ate a lot. So there's not. But imagine this is 490. 7 times, 70 times. Too much to count just by looking at it. And so Jesus' point is literally you should keep track of every time that someone wrongs you. And then once they reach that 490 times, which really would only apply to those like your siblings, that you probably need to forgive 7 times in one day, then all you got to do is, there's 365 days a year, then pretty much a year and a half, and you've forgiven your siblings as much as you really need to. So Jesus is saying keep track because 490 is the number. No? Oh, so it's not literal. He's saying you need to just forgive them forever and not just like a number that's going to be really hard to keep track. Oh, okay. Thank you for that, because I think that's actually the right answer. Give her a round of applause. So, and that's true. Jesus is saying, I was making sure you guys were paying attention, and you were, so good on you. But Jesus is basically saying that, actually, you shouldn't keep track of how many times you need to forgive somebody. Can you imagine if God kept track of how many times you've disobeyed against him and held it over your head? If like you went to God, like, I said like the analogy, like we sin against our siblings probably, probably at least 7 times a day, right? Can you imagine how many times we have a sinful thought, or we give into temptation, or we lie to somebody, or we flick our siblings, or we do something in a one day? Like, it's probably more than 7. And so, if God were tallying up our number, we wouldn't even make it a year before God would be like, all right, I've forgiven you 70 times, 7 times. Be away with you, right? God doesn't do that. He forgives us basically an infinite amount of times. And so he's saying, Jesus, and this is when Peter is asking this of Jesus. This is before Jesus has died and rose from the dead. So there's not been a resurrection yet. There's not been this whole Jesus died for our sins thing yet. And so Jesus, though, he knows that's going to happen. And he knows that he is going to forgive us an infinite amount of time. So he's basically saying, and what you need to know about this time period in this culture as well, is that numbers carry weight. They carry more meaning than actual literal, so 7, think about the 7 days of creation, 6 days of creation, 1 of rest, 7. It's a representation of completion. Remember when Joseph was in Egypt, and he said there's going to be 7 years of famine, or 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine. 7 represents completion in the Bible. Every time you see 7, it represents completion. So when Jesus is saying 70 times 7, he's really saying the ultimate completion amount of completion. It's a number that represents this this is how it will be an incomplete, almost kind of twisting it backwards, but 7 times 70, it's a number that means a perfect amount of times, meaning an infinite amount of times. It's going to take a lot to forgive people, because people make a lot of mistakes. You make a lot of mistakes that I've forgiven you for, and you're going to be able to need to give that benefit to other people around you as well. And so I think he's made his point. And what we have to recognize is we have to keep forgiving until the forgiveness actually changes something inside of us. He wasn't just giving us this number so that we could keep track of how many times people have caused us pain. But it means forgiving, that we should forgive until we can choose to not let our anger towards the other person dictate our actions. How many of you know that when you're mad at somebody, it changes something in your heart, and it makes you a person you don't really enjoy that much? You don't like to be angry all the time. You like to be a happy person. And when you allow someone else to steal your joy because you're having a hard time letting go of whatever it was that they did to you, it's hurting you more than it's hurting them. We talked about this in week 1. But until we can choose to speak kind words about them, then maybe we need to keep forgiving them. Maybe it's not a one-time thing, even if it was a one-time offense towards us. Maybe it's something we need to keep doing just for our own hearts. Until we choose not to spill the tea about what they did to us behind our back, we need to keep forgiving them. Until we can choose to not get back at them for what they did, we need to keep forgiving them. Until we can choose to move on, even if they never apologize, we need to keep forgiving them until something changes inside of us. 7 times 70 times. We need to forgive until something inside of us changes. It's kind of like, how many of you guys have ever broken an arm before? Or any other bone? You have recently. So, like, I've got a picture of an x-ray here. Like, when you break an arm, like, it's not good, right? That's what's going on if you look in the x-ray. Now, sometimes, what do you have to do, right? You have to wear something. What's it called? A cast. You got to wear a cast. Sometimes you got to put it in a sling, right? And can you like hit people with that because it's really hard? No, that would be bad, right? You got to let it heal. You got to keep it in the same position a lot of times. And you got to, sometimes it'll heal on its own, you know, and sometimes if it's not a bad break, if it's more like a fracture, it will heal more quickly. But sometimes, if you check out this next picture, it's not even just sometimes it needs a little more help, and you need to put screws in it and pins. Sometimes it needs surgery, right? And so it will heal either way, however long it takes. It will heal eventually, most likely, if you get it set right. But it'll never be the same. Like, it'll go off in metal detectors because you're half robot now, right? But cyborg, but no, I'm just kidding. But you've got something different that's holding your arm together. So it'll still work. You'll still have functionality. It'll still, you won't be able to tell day to day that it was ever broken, but it's still different. And the same is true with forgiveness. Sometimes it takes more time, and sometimes you're different afterwards. You're not the same, but it doesn't mean forgiveness hasn't happened. Does that make sense? Sometimes forgiveness takes more time, and sometimes it does change us and changes the situation. But it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. Forgiveness takes time. Sometimes it takes a really long time. But it's still possible. So, if I were to encourage you with things that you could keep in mind when it comes to moving on from the wrongs that people have done towards you, then first, it's to recognize that because it takes time, it takes practice. Right? It's kind of like a muscle in itself that you have to build. Some people, the older you get, hopefully, and the more mature in your faith you get, the easier it will be to forgive people. And you won't let it like transform you into an ugly, bitter person. You'll be able to forgive more. Even when people's offenses towards you are bigger, you'll be able to forgive a little bit easier because you'll recognize how much you've been forgiven, if you remember from last week's message. But also, you understand that life is more than just the grievances you have with other people. So, forgiveness, it takes practice, and it will get easier over time. But it will take practice. It will take 7 times, 70 times, forgiving people before it becomes more second nature. Secondly, you can ask for help. Go to God. Say, God, I want to forgive, but it's really hard for me right now. Have I told you the story of Corrie ten Boom? Like, Corrie ten Boom was someone during World War II. She was a Jew. Her dad housed Jews, and when the Nazis came looking for Jews, they had secret compartments in their house where they could hide people. So they were one of the heroes back then. But they got caught one time. They got arrested. They put in concentration camps. Her dad died shortly after. She lost her sister at the hand of one of the guards. And then she made it out. She lived. And then she wrote books. She became a speaker. She traveled around. And her story became very famous. If you just Google her after this Corrie ten Boom, it's an amazing story. But at one point, she was talking about her experience to a crowd. This was after the war and stuff. And afterwards, one of the guards that was personally responsible for the death of some of her family members came up to her after her speech. And I think it's in her book, but she talks about, I knew the godly thing was to forgive that person, but I didn't know how to forgive that person for what they had done. And he reached out his hand and said he was sorry. And she says in that moment, she just prayed for God to help her mean the next words out of her mouth because she wasn't going to be able to mean them on her own. And she goes, I forgive you. She said at the minute she shook his hand, she felt this warmth over her body. I like to think it's the Holy Spirit. And she was able to just let it go. And a beautiful thing happened that day. And sometimes that's what you need to do. You need to ask for help. You need to say, God, give me The forgiveness that I know I need to extend to this person because I don't know how I'm going to do it on my own. And beautiful things can happen because of that. Or talk to a small group leader, a trusted friend, about what you're wrestling with and how you can forgive. You know, it's not something you have to do just on your own. Number 3, it's okay if things change. It's okay if you got some screws and pins in there holding things together for a while. It's okay if things change. Maybe that means like you really are sorry and there's been forgiveness, but you need to stay broken up with that person. Maybe it means that you forgive your friend for talking about you behind your back, for spreading a rumor. But just because you've forgiven each other doesn't mean that you're as close as you once were. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's okay if things change, even though it doesn't mean that forgiveness hasn't happened. So just remember that. 4, this is about you. It's about the condition of your heart. You're not holding them to account by not forgiving them. You're not like somehow punishing them. And they're not winning if you forgive them. It's about you and the condition of your heart. When you let go, it's freedom that you experience and you alone. And that can only happen through forgiveness and letting go of the things that are holding you back. So remember, back to week 1, when you forgive, or when you don't forgive, it hurts you. When you don't forgive, it hurts you. Last week we talked about how everybody needs forgiveness. And this week we kind of wrap this up by saying that forgiveness takes time. And that's okay. Even if it requires a lot of time, I promise that it will be worth every second that it changes you for the rest of your life. Forgiveness is a big deal. And oftentimes, unforgiveness is what holds the church back from really being able to take ground for the kingdom. Because if we can't forgive each other, how are we supposed to tell the rest of the world about this amazing forgiveness that our God has given us? Kind of makes our testimony moot. Kind of makes it lose some of its oomph, if you know what I'm saying. So remember that about forgiveness. And as you guys get ready to go to your small groups, think about this. What's one thing that you want to remember about forgiveness? Whether it's something that we've talked about in this lesson or something that we've talked about during the series or you've talked about in groups over the last few weeks, whatever it is, what's one thing that you want to remember about forgiveness as you try to apply it to your life moving forward? Let me pray, and then you guys will go to your small groups.